April 1925. The air inside the Harvard College Observatory is thick with the scent of old books, floor polish, and the quiet, immense pressure of academic judgment. Dust motes dance in the slanted afternoon light, illuminating a room where history is about to be made and then immediately suppressed. At the front stands a young woman, Cecilia Payne, not yet 25 years old. She is an outsider in every sense, a woman in a field dominated by men, an Englishwoman in the heart of American academia, a brilliant mind about to present a truth so profound it sounds like heresy. Before her sits a panel of esteemed astronomers, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and deep-seated skepticism. They are the gatekeepers of cosmic knowledge, men who have built their careers on a shared understanding of the universe, an understanding she is about to shatter. Her doctoral thesis, the culmination of years of painstaking work, lies before them. Its title, Stellar Atmospheres, is deceptively modest. Within its pages is a revolution. To understand the shockwave she was about to send through this room, you have to understand what these men, and indeed the entire scientific world, believed about the stars. The prevailing wisdom, largely based on the composition of Earth and meteorites, was that stars were made of the same stuff as our own planet, just much, much hotter. They assumed a cosmic uniformity. By analyzing the light from stars, they saw signatures of familiar elements like iron, calcium, and silicon. The conclusion seemed obvious. The Sun and the Earth shared a similar chemical makeup. This was the bedrock of astrophysics. But Cecilia Payne had a new tool, or rather, a new way of using an old one. She was applying the revolutionary new science of quantum mechanics to the practice of spectroscopy, the art of breaking down starlight into its constituent colors like a prism. Each element, when heated, emits or absorbs light at specific frequencies, creating a unique barcode of dark or bright lines in its spectrum. Payne's genius was not just in observing these lines, but in understanding what they truly meant. She realized that the temperature and pressure of a star's atmosphere dramatically affected how these spectral lines appeared. A very faint line from an element didn't necessarily mean there was very little of that element. It could mean the star's temperature wasn't right to excite its atoms into showing their true colors. She spent thousands of hours analyzing the photographic glass plates from the Harvard collection, a library of starlight containing over 500,000 spectra, meticulously classified by a legion of women known as the Harvard computers, including the legendary Annie Jump Cannon. Payne built on their work but took a radical leap. Using complex equations derived from the new quantum theory, she calibrated the strength of the spectral lines against stellar temperatures. Her calculations, checked and rechecked, led her to a conclusion that was both undeniable and, to the establishment, unthinkable. Her data showed that the familiar heavy elements like iron and silicon were merely trace contaminants. The vast, overwhelming majority of stellar matter, and by extension, the visible universe, was composed of the two lightest and simplest elements, hydrogen and helium. She had discovered that the universe was, in a very real sense, made of almost nothing but starlight fuel. It was a discovery that would rewrite cosmology, a truth that would one day be printed in every science textbook on the planet. But on that day in 1925, it was not met with applause. It was met with disbelief. The most powerful voice in the room belonged to her advisor, Henry Norris Russell, the director of the Princeton University Observatory and the most influential astronomer of his generation. Russell was the titan of American astronomy, a man whose opinion could make or break a career. He looked at her data, at the elegant mathematics, at the mountain of evidence she had compiled, and he dismissed it. The conclusion that stars were so fundamentally different in composition from the Earth was, in his expert opinion, clearly impossible. The sheer dominance of hydrogen, he proposed, was an absurdity that flew in the face of all accepted geological and astronomical wisdom. He was a man of immense intellect, but he was also a guardian of the existing paradigm. The pressure on Payne must have been immense. She was a doctoral candidate, a young woman seeking a foothold in a world that had barely cracked the door open for her. To defy a figure like Russell was career suicide. He didn't just disagree, he compelled her, with the full weight of his authority, to add a disclaimer to her own masterpiece, a sentence of forced self-doubt. In her final dissertation, she wrote that the calculated abundances of hydrogen and helium were improbably high and likely spurious. She had uncovered the fundamental truth of the cosmos, only to be forced to apologize for it. The universe's true composition remained obscured, not by the vast distances of space or the limitations of technology, but by the intellectual inertia and patriarchal authority of its most respected observers. Who decides what is possible, and whose voice is allowed to define it?
Following that forced retraction, Cecilia Payne did not retreat. She did not abandon her work. Instead, she did what so many brilliant women in her position were forced to do. She endured. She accepted a position at the Harvard College Observatory, but not as a professor or even a full-fledged researcher. Her official title for years was Technical Assistant to the new director, Harlow Shapley. It was a title that belied the monumental nature of her intellect, effectively demoting her to the status of a glorified calculator, even as she was conducting some of the most important astronomical research of the century. Her days were a relentless pursuit of cosmic truth, spent in the quiet archives, poring over more glass plates, each one a frozen snapshot of a star's soul. She amassed more data, refined her calculations, and her initial, impossible conclusion grew ever more robust, ever more certain. The evidence was overwhelming, a silent chorus of Starlight, all singing the same song of hydrogen's dominance. Yet, while the evidence was astronomical, the barriers she faced were deeply, frustratingly human. The systemic bias that had compelled her to dilute her thesis now manifested in her daily life. It was in the condescending titles, the professional invisibility, and most tangibly, in her paycheck. The injustice became starkly, undeniably clear 4 years later. In 1929, the very man who had publicly dismissed her work, Henry Norris Russell, published a paper of his own. Using a different method of analysis, but arriving at the exact same conclusion, he announced that the sun was, in fact, predominantly composed of hydrogen. The discovery was hailed as a major breakthrough. And because it came from the mouth of the great Henry Norris Russell, the scientific establishment accepted it without question. To his credit, Russell did briefly acknowledge Payne's 1925 thesis in his paper, noting that she had arrived at the same result earlier. But this was no simple correction of the record. It was the anatomy of academic appropriation. The initial, public dismissal of her work by the ultimate authority had already done its damage. He had declared her brilliant original insight impossible, effectively putting it on ice for 4 years. Then, once he had satisfied himself of its truth, he became its primary validator and, in the eyes of many, its originator. The credit, the acclaim, and the historical narrative now centered on him. Years later, in 1929, Henry Norris Russell published his own paper, and the world applauded the man who confirmed the truth, largely forgetting the woman who had discovered it. This theft of legacy was mirrored by a more mundane, yet equally corrosive, theft of resources and respect. Despite her unparalleled brilliance and productivity, she would go on to publish hundreds of papers and several books. Payne spent decades in a professional limbo at Harvard. She taught courses on astrophysics, but her name wasn't listed in the university catalog. Male colleagues, often less qualified, were hired as professors to teach the very subjects she had pioneered, earning salaries that dwarfed her own meager stipend. She was a ghost in the Harvard machine, her labor and intellect essential to its function, but her identity and status officially denied. This wasn't a vague theoretical bias. It was quantified in ledger books and departmental rosters. It was the cold, hard arithmetic of sexism. Her requests for research funding were often ignored, her path to promotion blocked by an invisible but impenetrable wall of institutional prejudice. She was a world-leading scientist trapped in the role of an assistant, a role deemed appropriate for her gender. Her struggle highlights a devastating truth. The system wasn't just failing to recognize her, it was actively profiting from her marginalization, getting world-class research and teaching on a technical assistance budget. It begs a chilling question. We know about Cecilia Payne because her discovery was too fundamental to be permanently erased. But how many more brilliant insights were stifled? How many more breakthroughs were not just delayed but lost forever? Because the minds that conceived them belonged to women who were denied the resources, the platform, and the simple credit they deserved.
Building on those years of unacknowledged toil, a slow but undeniable shift began to occur. Truth, like gravity, has a way of asserting itself over time. While Henry Norris Russell may have initially claimed the spotlight, the true cognoscenti of the astronomical world knew where the real breakthrough had originated. Fellow astronomers, like the influential Otto Struve, began to reference her 1925 thesis not as a curious footnote, but as the seminal work it was. In 1962, Struve would write what has now become a famous judgment, calling Payne's work the most brilliant PhD thesis ever written in astronomy. The dam of institutional silence had broken. Her dissertation, once dismissed and diluted, was now being recognized for what it always was, a foundational text that underpins all modern astrophysics. Her discovery wasn't just a single fact, it was the key that unlocked our entire understanding of the universe's engine. It explained how stars generate energy through nuclear fusion, converting hydrogen into helium. It laid the groundwork for understanding stellar evolution, how stars are born, how they live, and how they die, seeding the cosmos with the heavier elements necessary for life. Every time we discuss the life cycle of a star, from a red giant to a white dwarf, we are speaking a language that Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin first taught us to write. Her insight is the silent, essential first chapter in the story of cosmic creation. Eventually, even the hallowed halls of Harvard could no longer ignore the giant in their midst. The institutional barriers, so rigid for so long, began to crack under the sheer weight of her accomplishments and her growing international reputation. In 1938, she was finally given the official title of astronomer. But it was a long, arduous climb. It wasn't until 1956, more than 30 years after she presented her revolutionary thesis, that she was finally promoted to a full professor, the first woman to achieve this rank at Harvard through the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. A few years later, she shattered another barrier, becoming the first woman to chair a department at Harvard. These were monumental victories, not just for her, but for every woman in science who would follow. Yet even in these positions of power, the ghost of systemic bias remained. Archival records confirm that she continued to be paid a significantly lower salary than her male counterparts holding equivalent positions. The fight for recognition was one battle. The fight for true equality was another, and it was one she would wage for her entire life. Her name may not be as famous as Hubble or Einstein, a tragic consequence of the initial suppression and the quiet, pervasive nature of historical erasure. But her legacy is written across the night sky. It shines in every star we observe. It is encoded in every spectrum we analyze, and it fuels every theory we have about the origins of our universe. In her autobiography, she reflected on her career with a characteristic blend of humility and quiet defiance, noting the immense resistance she faced, but never expressing bitterness, only an unyielding passion for the scientific quest. Her story is a powerful, poignant reminder that a discovery is only the first step. The journey to acceptance, to credit, and to justice is often a much longer and more difficult road, especially for those who challenge the established order from the margins.
Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin's light was too bright to be extinguished. She proved that the universe was made of starlight, and in doing so, became a star herself, a guide for future generations. The question her story forces us to confront remains urgent. How many more unsung heroes, their brilliance obscured by prejudice, are still waiting for their light to be seen and their stories to be told?